Alright, my presentation is about the United States involvement in Latin America during the Cold War. I'm going to talk about a bunch of messed up stuff that our government did to different countries that really couldn't do anything about it under the disguise as national interest. First off is Guatemala. Jacobo Arbenz was a democratically elected leader of Guatemala during the 1950s. During his time in Guatemala, the United States controlled the electrical utility, the Lone Railroad, and the entire banana industry. The importance of America owning the banana industry in Guatemala is that during this point in time, bananas were the prime export of Guatemala. Arbenz realized that if the United States continued to keep the banana export under its control, that Guatemala would forever remain an underdeveloped country. Arbenz proposed a land reform that would threaten the majority of the United States' hold over the banana industry. But, of course, President Eisenhower would not stand for that. The CIA trained and led Guatemalan rebels, ousted Arbenz, and put in his place the ruthless dictator Castillo Armas. Armas kept himself in power for so long by changing laws and oppressing his people, using any tactics including violence. But of course, the United States backed him because he was against communism. Keep in mind that the majority of this change in presidency was over bananas. The people of Guatemala were plagued by 30 years of dictatorship literally over bananas. Bananas weren't the only reason that the United States felt compelled to involve themselves in different Latin American countries during the Cold War. The U.S. felt that if one country fell to communism, the surrounding countries might fall as well. This is called the domino theory. Lyndon B. Johnson and the CIA were never really comfortable with Brazil and its president, João Goulart, because of this very reason. The government of Brazil was not so much a communist one, but Goulart saw no reason to oust communists from his country and allow them to work within his government. Over the years, the CIA spends millions of dollars in an eventually successful attempt to economically destabilize the government of Brazil and then arms rebels in an aided overthrowing of the democratically elected president. The government that took that place was much like the one previously discussed, a military dictatorship. In Brazil for the next 15 years, there was no Congress or any sort of political opposition to the ruling party. Word of the government was the final word. Brazil went from having close ties to Cuba to not having any ties to Cuba. Of course, after all of this mess, Brazil was possibly the closest ally to America in Latin America. The bananas in Guatemala may not even be the most ridiculous example of our country's inability to deal with the loss of control. During the U.S. occupation of Panama in 1964, riots began to break out because of the American government had declined the 1962 joint Panama-U.S. flag flying agreement. This is pretty self-explanatory. It literally means that the military would not allow Panama to fly their flag in the Panama Canal. There were several different places flying the American flag, yet only one Panama flag in the entire canal. The United States eventually gave in to the agreement, but was still very reluctant to actually let Panama fly their flag, thinking that the military would lose some control over the people. Citizens of Panama began to rebel against the American military for some time until 200 Panamanian students took action into their own hands. They marched into the canal zone with their flag, trying to fly it. They were met by approximately 5,000 American troops and several tanks. In the end of the entire conflict, 4 Panamanian students were left dead. Many people are familiar with the U.S. involvement in Iran during the Contra scandal, and have at least maybe heard of some of these different conflicts and power struggles in Latin America, but few people are aware of the atrocities committed in El Salvador during the country's civil war. Beginning in the Carter presidency into the presidency of George Bush, the United States government sent $5 million of military aid every year to the military government, eventually totaling around $7 billion. This news wasn't met with much protest until a Salvadorian National Guard death squad brutally raped and murdered 4 American nuns who were all on a relief mission. The same people the government was funding were committing these heinous crimes, and we were supporting it indirectly. Most Americans are under the impression that after this news became public that President Carter suspended the aid to El Salvador and all was well from there. This is partially true. President Carter did temporarily suspend the aid, but he was pressured into resuming. Many people in the government and the CIA felt that although the military in El Salvador was committing all these injustices, It was a lesser evil than possible Soviet influence that would happen if we didn't help them. President Carter was very hesitant to help the military regime in Salvador, but his successor, President Ronald Reagan, did not think twice about it. President Reagan exceeded the amount of military units he could send to a country by twisting the definition of military personnel, and then painted the picture that the military regime in Salvador was not doing any of the death squad activities they were infamous for. The Reagan administration eventually promised the military regime more aid if they would crack down on the death squads, knowing that the public was vehemently opposed to their brutal and often unnecessary tactics. The regime gave in and demoted many officers and transferred those accused of crimes to different places. In my opinion, titling the Cold War as such does not make any sense. Sure, the United States government never actually fired any shots at the USSR, and likewise, but if you look, we and many victims of our national interests lost a great deal of lives over several decades. History often repeats itself, but for the sake of not only our own country, but other countries who fall victim to our ideological imperialism, I hope this segment of history doesn't. We cannot stand as a country if we try to overthrow anyone close to us who doesn't align themselves with us politically.